this is Sasa here, and today in this video I'll be showcasing how I make kimono-like style tops, specifically for cosplay. This video will be in two parts. The first one is the sewing instructions step by step, and the second part will be making the pattern and modifying it to your body size. I also show off different ways to modify it to suit your character better. This pattern and sewing steps I use to make Gen from Dr. Stone, Ikumatsu from Gintama, as well as a lot of other Gintama characters, especially for Katsura. This is my collar, and it's going to be folded in half. You can make it wider or skinnier, as well as longer or shorter, depending on your character. Some fabric looks the same from both the right and the wrong side. I look at the selvage to find the right or the wrong side, and then I use a pin to mark which is the right side, and I do this for all the pieces once I cut them. It saves you time later on. Around the neck area, I add extra fabric or interfacing to stiffen that area because it's nicer if it's more firm. There are 2 or 3 options that I use depending on my fabric. Normally I use a piece of poly cotton. I either use white or black depending on the fabric. I don't put the extra stiffener or poly cotton on the whole collar. I only do just around the neck area. If the collar fabric is too thin or has a slight stretch to it, I will put fusible interfacing on the collar part around the neck. If the interfacing is not enough, I will still add the piece of poly cotton. So it has both the fusible and the poly cotton. So here I'm just showing you what the interfacing looks like on my fabric. So you iron it on and it sticks to the fabric. This fabric does not need fusible interfacing. I'm just going to use the poly cotton. So I iron both the collar parts in half. This collar will not go all the way to the end of the top, so I close off the ends. I sew it across, I trim off the extra fabric, and then flip it right side out. So I go back to the ironing board and I press the corners. This is my sleeve pattern, and there is no seam on the top, so on the top of your arm, but there is an underarm seam. So you cut it and fold it in half and sew the underarm seam. If you don't have a serger, there are other ways to finish off your seams. I don't want a shoulder seam or any seams on the front, so the pattern is made like this, where the seam is in the center back. With the right sides together, you sew the center back seam. So next is to open it up and fold over the front so that we can sew the side seams. Ironing and pressing is a really important step to make sure that your garment looks really nice at the end. I iron the seam flat first, and then I press it to one side. And I also press again from the right side. To help keep the top closed in the front, I use ribbon ties for the inner tie. For outer ties, I'll normally make them out of the same fabric as the top. This is just 100% polyester ribbon, and since it's polyester, you're able to melt the ends so that they don't fray with a lighter. Be careful not to use a lighter on cotton because it will catch fire, burn, and turn black. I put the ties at around where my waist level is, so you're going to need to try it on and decide where that placement is for you. And you need to pay attention to which side you attach the ties to, because the left side is always worn on top of the right side. The right over the left is for the dead. To mark the placement for the sleeves, I take the sleeve and place it flat against the body, and I place a pin exactly at where it needs to be. And when I sew, I will start and stop at that pin, so it will be easy to fit the sleeve. Since each sleeve size can be a little bit different, I will pin that sleeve to that side so that when you go to the machine, you won't mix it up. So I sew along, and when I get close to the pin, I will switch. Instead of using my foot pedal, I'll use the hand wheel, and I'll go stitch by stitch until it gets there. Then I lift the presser foot and I twist the fabric, and then I sew right off. I place the sleeve inside the body with right sides together, and I match up the underarm seam, and then I check it if it fits. If one is a little bit big or too small, I will either undo the stitches or I will sew it a little bit more until it fits perfectly. Afterwards, I'll sew around a circle, and the thread I just tied in a knot. After sewing a sleeve, I will flip it the right side out, and I'll check to make sure I caught everything, especially the armpit area. So this depends on what your character looks like and where the collar sits. My collar needs to be where I put the waist tie is, because I want to hide the end. So I try it on the jacket, and I put pins to check where the collar will start and stop. I roughly measure the collar to the fabric. I'm looking for where it hits the center back, and I put a pin here. I fold the polycotton in half and place a pin at its center. So these two center parts I'm going to line up. I place the polycotton inside the collar, and I place some pins to keep it in place. Don't worry if the white part sticks out a bit. When you sew it, the serger will cut it off. You can baste the polycotton to the collar with your sewing machine if you feel more comfortable. I'm able to do it all in one step, so I don't do that. Basting is long stitches to temporarily hold fabric together. I use clips to attach the collar to the main body. On the left front side, so depending on where my collar is, the angle might not be very straight. So this part, I'm just cutting it off. On the right side, the angle doesn't matter because it's going to be hidden. I sew with the collar on top. So I start with the right side, and I sew the bottom half of the front. When you get to the curve in the neck, you want to go slowly and hold the fabric. I hold the fabric one way until I get to the corner, then I push the fabric the other way so it doesn't get caught. I'm able to do this all in one step. However, if it helps, you can use the sewing machine first to baste the top. Since I'm sewing 5 layers of fabric together, the fabric moves. So at places where a bump shows up, I will push the fabric underneath the presser foot and just sew over. This bump will only be seen on the wrong side. It won't be shown on the front. If you don't do these bumps throughout the collar, you'll get this one big lump at the end, and it will be all out of alignment. There are other ways of attaching the collar, similar to the ways how you sew bias tape. However, this method, I find it's the fastest, easiest, and I don't have to do any hand sewing. After sewing the collar, I check both sides to see that I caught everything. If you missed a little bit, especially on the neck corners, I find if you go back with the serger and you try to cut off more, you'll end up cutting too much. So instead, I will go on my sewing machine and I'll just sew an extra line wherever I missed. To hem the sleeve cuff, I fold over once and then twice, and I sew around. If it helps you, you can iron this before sewing. If there are ties, I will sew the tie at the edge of the collar. For the top stitching around the collar, I sew from the wrong side. And I sew in between the stitching lines of the serger. When you get to the neck corners, be careful to move the fabric out of the way so you won't catch and have any bumps. If you're having difficulty with this, you can sew from the right side. That way you'll see where exactly you're sewing. For the bottom hem, I'll fold over once and then twice, and I sew across. The bottom hem, I normally make it a bit thicker than I do the sleeves, but that's your personal choice. And the last step is to give it a final iron and all the seams and all the hems. This is a variation without any sleeves, so it's a vest. It's the same as those string ties for the inner. Before attaching the collar, I sewed a piece of Velcro, and this part is to keep the front part closed. This vest is not for me, so I'm waiting for the person to try it on, and then I can position the other piece of Velcro, and I sew it on the right side. This vest, instead of Velcro, has ties on both sides. The outer ties I made with the same blue fabric. I made the collar go all the way to the end on the left side, and this is because this vest is going to be worn tucked into the pants, and I want to make sure that the collar is all the way inside. So this top has long strings on the collar only, and there is an opening in the back. So I'll pass the right string through the hole, and then I'll tie them together. So those are the few options that you have on how to tie and close the top, depending on what you like. For the example in this video, I chose to top stitch the collar down. That means you can see the stitching from the right side. Sometimes I decide not to do the top stitching and I will iron it only. For the arm opening for vests, I simply hem it with my sewing machine. For tops that are tucked into pants, especially tight pants, instead of doing a full hem on the bottom, I will opt for serging it straight to stop the fraying. And this method removes the extra bulk. So this pattern is based on two things. I don't want a seam on the top of the shoulder, and I don't want any seams in the front. So that means the widest part of the fabric will be the front. So in order to have the shape, you're going to need the seam in the center back. This holds true for most of the tops I make. However, for Hozuki, he has a large artwork in the center back, and I didn't want a seam going down the artwork. So I decided to put some seams in the front instead. So when you're taking your measurements, you need to measure your hips, your waist, and your chest. And it's important to know what is the widest part of you, because that's how much you need the top to overlap. For the shoulders, it's going to be off your shoulder. It will not sit on your shoulder. It's at least 2 to 3 inches off your shoulder. All the lines are straight. For the sleeves, you'll need to know how long you want it and how much you want it to drop. So you can make the armhole bigger or smaller, as well as have drop sleeves. if you want. The back measurement will be bigger than half of your largest part. So either your waist, hips, or your chest. For me, my largest is my hips at 38 inches. And the back I normally go with is like 11 and a quarter times 2. So it's about 22 inches for the back. To get your front measurement, it's going to be larger than the back. So the half of the back. So my back is 11 and a quarter. So it needs to be bigger than that. I go with 15 inches. So I measure from about the side of my body to how much I want it to cross over. Getting the length is pretty easy. You measure from the top of your shoulder, so where the fabric folds. I normally stand in front of a mirror and hold my measuring tape. And I just dangle it to where I want it to end. Either my thigh, my hips. So there are different sleeve variations. One is where at the armpit it's bigger and then it tapers towards the wrist, so meaning it gets slimmer. The other is a basic square rectangle. So it's the same at the armpit and the same at the wrist. Another one is a drop. So it's the armpit area is connected in a small area and then the rest of the sleeve drops out and it's free flowing. It's more of a like female kimono style. All of the sleeves have a fold at the very top of the arm. I don't like having a seam there. So the seam is on the bottom of the sleeve. For the two rectangle sleeves, the place where your arm comes out, you can either sew it a little bit so the opening is a little bit smaller for your hand, or you can have the whole sleeve to be open. So the main body pattern is a very long rectangle with the front being a little bit bigger. You need to cut 2 of the body. To know how much the front crosses over your body, I'll measure from one side of my neck and I'll take the measuring tape to cross it over my body so it's on the opposite side. So if I took the tape on my left side of my neck, I'll bring the other end to the right side of my body and that will create an angle. And depending on where I want the end of the front to stop, that's where I'll put the measuring tape. I find it's roughly around 22 to 26 inches, but this depends on your height. For the back measurement, which is half of it because we're only looking at half, that would be half of their back. To determine the length, that would be that 30 1/4 inches right there. So it's from the top of your shoulder to either your waist, your hips. 61 inches is half of the length that I want. But when you're making the length, you may need to add more because the body is not flat. If you have more curves, you'll need to add more inches to the length. To determine the length, you take from your shoulder and you measure down to the body part or where you want the bottom of the top, or you can even make it fuller length. And then that number you need to times it by 2 to get the long measurement, which is, for me here, it's 61 inches. So for the top of the shoulder, it hangs off of the shoulder about 2 to 3 inches. For the back of the neck, where that curve is, I find 6 to 7 inches is a good measurement. If you're making a vest or a top that is tucked into your pants, you're going to want the collar to go all the way down. And so the angle of the front left piece has to be straight. So here I show the different sleeve variations. Either it drops longer or it's tighter to the body. To get the measurement, you measure from the top of your arm to how long you want it to drop. And make sure that when you measure it, if your arm is not straight out, meaning it's down by your body, the sleeve will be longer. So it could drag on the floor if you make it too long. But this depends on what you're going for. If my videos and tutorials helped you create something, please tag me. I would love to see your work. Please check out my channel for playlists on cooking, sewing, cosplay, and other tutorials. You can support me by buying me an online coffee, which is a donation of increments by $3, or you can buy anything from my Etsy shop. It's all handmade by me. I really appreciate your support. Thank you so much. I hope you have fun with your projects. Bye bye!